Will you please state your name in relation to Voltaire?
I am Francois Arouet, and I am his father. He is my youngest out of 5 children. When he was born in 1694, and his given name, Francois Marie Arouet, not that pen name which I believe to be an anagram of the Latinized form Arvet le Lune, of his name Arouet le Jeune, which means Arouet the Younger, because I am a notary also named Francois.
Well, can you tell us what he was like?
Francois Marie was sort of rowdy, though clever, child. Very obsessed with literature and poetry. Very outspoken at his school, Jesuit College in Paris College of Louis le Grand. Despite when I would lightly hint to him I wanted him to become a lawyer or someone of government. After his mother, Marie Marguerite, died when he was 7 years old, he started to rebel against me and attached himself to his godfather, the Abbé de Chateauneuf, a freethinker and Epicurean. I think due to his godfather, he started to become skeptical of the Jesuit education he was receiving, which was extremely prestigious and first class, and the religion involved in it always so unappreciated. But I was always rational with my son. Always.
So, can you tell us about the last years of Louis XIV and before you were thrown into jail at Bastille and exiled from France in 1717?
First of all, my exile in 1717 were on petty charges, and the years of King Louis XIV reigned were the best. He was a great honor. His last years, including the War of 1709, the Spanish Succession War, and his death in 1715, brought many ideas to me. The religious persecution was horrible. I deeply miss King Louis. He was a magnificent king.
Louis XIV could sometimes be described as a tyrant and tried to convert French Protestants and revoke the Edict of Nantes, which had guaranteed freedom of worship in 1685. He called them rebels, which is very against your writings and philosophies. What is your placement on this?
Louis was a protector of writers. King Louis can never be announced without respect.
Care to enlighten us on your imprisonment of Bastille in 1717? It says you mocked the regent of Louis XV and his family, and you were banished from France.
The regent Duc d'Orleans for Louis XV was no one near the greatness of Louis XIV, the king before him. I was hardly mocking him. I was the wit of the Parisian society. Everybody loved me. Seems like he couldn't take a joke.
Documentation shows you weren't very popular at first due to your wittiness and how far you would take it.
Can we move on?
Can you tell us what the French regency and government was like at the time Voltaire lived?
Ah, yes, indeed. Well, France was a monarchy, dating back to the 9th century. This would end in 1789, but Voltaire would pass away 11 years before this in 1778. Essentially, it was a feudal nation. It had a monarchic and political system called the Ancient Regime. Rulings also happened through 3 social institutions or estates. You had their first estate, the clergy, the second estate, the nobility, and then the rest of the population was the third estate. Even the middle class who were educated were still a part of the third estate. And a heavy tax system was impended onto the third estate, but mostly absolute monarchy was practiced at the time. In total, it was a wide social gap between the French elite and the aristocracy in the third estate.
How do you think this affected Voltaire and his philosophies and writings?
Well, Voltaire, as notorious for loving Louis XIV, or the Sun King, which does not make much sense, as Voltaire was very against the religious intolerance of the French monarch and the First Estate Catholic clergy.
The time Voltaire was alive and writing was during the Enlightenment period in pre-revolutionary France. Did any of his enlightened ideas spur thoughts of revolution in France?
I believe they did. Voltaire was a huge influence on freedom of speech. which the Third Estate never got. May I remind you, even though Voltaire received a great and classical education, his middle-class status made him still in the Third Estate when he was younger. He disliked organized religion and wrote against the Catholic Church, which was a big no-no at the time in France. He believed it to be outdated and immoral. Some people, especially other English philosophers and people of the Third Estate who were literate could obtain his works, thought Voltaire courageous.
How did Voltaire learn so much about the Enlightenment ideas and the philosophers of England when France was so against reform?
Well, he was exiled again to England for 2 years. Yes, again.
So you came back to France after your exile to Bastille in 1718. Were the people of France welcoming?
Well, it was a slow climb back up the social ladder, but I was soon a favorite in the court of Versailles and my play Oedipe, a tragedy. It was one of my first successes, and this is when I developed my pen name in 1718. And then I worked on my epic, a poem called Henriade, which I completed in 1723. It was a favorite among the French people because it was about one of their favorite kings.
This is when you began to learn English. How did you and what made you learn it?
Well, one of my friends, another philosopher, which was an English Tory, Viscount Bolingbroke, who had been exiled from England, he saw my interest and pushed me to learn English so that I could read John Locke's works. I saw that England was more tolerant and I wanted to learn more.
And then you got exiled again to England due to a quarrel with a member of one of the leading French families, the Chevalier de Rohan. Seems like your wittiness was getting the best of you.
You know what?
Alrighty, sorry about that. Can you tell us about your time in England?
I discovered many new things, not just about England, but as France as well. I became fluent in English, and it brought light to me about the religious intolerance and class differences in France. I was furious.
How long did you stay there?
I stayed in England for over 2 years between 1726 and 1729.
Who were some of your correspondents and friends at the time?
Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and William Congreve, the philosopher George Berkeley, and Samuel Clarke, the theologian.
You even went against Bolingbroke, your sort of English guide. Why was that?
I wanted to experience everything while in Europe. There was a huge class difference between the two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. Bolingbroke was a famous and powerful story, but I would enter Whig circles every now and then and get more information for my works in philosophy.
You are always related to the Newton apple myth. How is that?
Well, while in England, I met Newton's sister, and she told me about this story of how Newton discovered gravity by an apple falling onto his head, and then the ground. I would further popularize this in my works, an essay on epic poetry in 1727. I found it very amusing.
When did you move back to France?
In 1729.
And how was you regaining your high class status you had before?
Well, it took me a few years. My works made me very popular, but I did not care much about my class in society anymore after realizing the intolerance in France. But by the fall of 1732, I was residing in the royal court of Versailles.
And then you would publish your Letters de Philosophies in 1734, which rewarded the English and their top philosophers and scholars like Bacon, Locke, and Newton, and even Shakespeare, on their religious tolerance and achievements, and sort of bashed the French and René Descartes, famous for "I think, therefore I am," whom France loved. Your conclusion of the work was, "The purpose of life is not to reach heaven through patience, but to assure happiness to all men by progress in the sciences and the arts, a fulfillment for which their nature is destined." This caused a scandal amongst the French government and religious institutions.
I am not to blame. The Regency did not want to reform.
And you were exiled again in 1734, and you ran away with your mistress, Madame Emilie de Châteaulet.
Well, she died in 1749.
The papers Voltaire wrote, Letters de Philosophies, in 1734, bashed the French monarchs and the clergy for their religious intolerance.
Yes, the Catholic Church's name was slandered by him, but being the Gentiles and children of God we are, we calmly worked with the situation.
But Voltaire was exiled?
Well, that type of, next question, please.
And he escaped Bastille imprisonment because of his aristocratic mistress.
Well, of course the church disapproves of this.
Do you know some things about Madame Émilie de la Châtelet, Voltaire's mistress?
Well, she was a writer, a scientist in philosophy. She translated many English works to French. This isn't really approved of the church.
What wasn't very approved by the church?
Well, with the Madame being a mistress and a scholar and going against the church, and to top it all off, being a woman.
Moving on. So due to your published work in 1734, you were exiled and you fled to your mistress's home in Sarry at Champagne.
Yes, I lived with Madame de Châtelet for over 15 years.
How did the Madame affect your philosophy?
Well, she was a scholar, broadened my information on physics, metaphysics, philosophy, and the Old and New Testament. This would really give me inspiration. She also helped me write Elements de la Philosophie de Newton in 1738. It was about English science, which the French were so sheltered from.
How was the reaction to this?
Lots of followers of Descartes thought my work on Newton almost blasphemous. Some said I was rebelling, some said they admired me for my rebelling and courage, and some acknowledged what it was, pure science. The regency and clergy still disapproved, though.
And finally, when your court order caught up to you in May of 1739, you and the Madame started to move all around Europe. And this is when you started corresponding with the Prince of Persia, who was rebelling against his father, the king, and taking refuge in French culture. Is this correct?
Yes. But I do not see why you keep bringing up my past court orders.
Well, this is history.
This is history? This is history?
Alright, we're going to try this again. So, after 1749, when the Madame sadly passed away, you joined the Prince of Persia, who was now the king, Frederick the Great of Persia.
Yes, he was a friend of mine, and I was sort of out of my wits without the Madame. It would help me regain my status in the old regime court in France and the power structure.
And shortly, you left the court in 1753 and moved to Sarry at Geneva. To do what?
To live out the rest of my life, write beautiful works, and cultivate my garden.
When you moved here, people started to call you the innkeeper of France. Why did this come about?
Yes, despite all my past accusations, the Enlightenment period was bring new ideas into the French people, and some of my papers were fueling the revolution. I was a fashionable philosopher of Paris.
You said you wanted to live your life in Sarry, but then you started to feel unsafe. Why, and what resulted from this?
I wasn't feeling safe anymore in Geneva with what all was happening in France at the time, and my papers weren't very popular with the king. I was a part of so many quarrels. This actually fueled me to write Candide.
Yes, it's labeled as your most favorite work. It's the philosophical fantasy. The young Candide suffered through so many hardships and misfortunes, and it made him unable to believe that this was the best of all possible worlds. Discovers the secret of happiness, which was to cultivate one's gardens, a philosophy about idealism. What does cultivate your gardens mean exactly?
I think one must take care of their own needs before one takes care of others first. Take care of your own and the world will take care of itself.
And this is directed at the church, correct?
Escarsis la infame.
That is translated to crush the loathsome thing, referring to the Roman Catholic Church. Thank you for your time, Voltaire.
You're welcome.